Hi again. Welcome to the second part of our first class. Right? Here we got our first topic, just introducing social psychology. What is social psych? But also going to include research methodology stuff. I know your favorite, right? Everybody's favorite. So the first couple of things we want to kind of establish is what is social psychology? So it may be easier than trying to define social psychology. It might be better to say what kind of things do they study and then define it from there. Um, some of the major ways to break down social psychology would be to talk about social thinking, how we think about ourselves, things that we believe, things of that nature. Social influence, what is how has the external world influenced the way we think and behave, perhaps more important. And then social relations, and we'll break down each of these at different topics at different points throughout the semester. Social psychology is distinctly different from sociology, even though in a sociology department they teach social psychology. I know, how confusing. But fundamentally, I mean, you can read these definitions, but fundamentally, social psychology is the study of how human beings become different people in the presence of others, whereas sociology is much more likely to focus on the behavior of a group. Okay, so group dynamics and how the groups behave, whereas what happens to you as an individual when others are present. Hmm? And so the central focus is on the individual here in psychology, and the central focus is on the group over there in sociology. Okay, but there's still going to be a lot of overlap. All right. What kinds of things are studied? How much of our social world is just in our heads? Now, this is pretty important because I mean it's like, what's more important? What Susie thinks about you, or what you think Susie thinks about you? I mean, that's a fact. It's what you believe. So a lot of our social reality is in our head. It's us interpreting cues and situations. Would people be cruel if ordered? I think we'll see a little bit of Milgram, and I think the answer is yes. Okay. To help or to help oneself. And again, there's a lot of factors involved. We'll talk about those things that determine whether or not people are helpful or selfish. Some bigger ideas in our social psychology. That's interesting. We construct our social reality. Gotcha. Our social intuitions are powerful. I'm going to talk about that in more detail, but we'll talk about in topic 3, I think. Anyway, we'll talk about how it's biologically rooted. I have that in a couple slides up, so I'll leave that. Attitudes shape our behavior, but our behavior also shapes our attitudes. All right, it's a two-way street. We'll talk about that. Social influences shape behavior. Absolutely, you're a product of the social environment that you grew up in, or the social environment you grew up in. It is a factor in making you. Social behavior is also biological. Oh my gosh, I'm going to talk about that. And so social psychology principles are applicable, absolutely. If you recall from the last little video I put together, I talked about the goals of the APA, and goal 5 is all about career preparation. And in this course, we're going to be talking fairly heavily about different ways that social psychology is applied in the clinic, in our legal system, and so we'll talk about how these principles are useful, but also in things such as marketing and persuasion, politics. I mean, many places social psychology's principles are used. So here's a cool one. We construct our social reality. I like that. And this really makes me think of what happened at the Charlottesville, I don't know, in Virginia. And the interpretation of the event afterwards, clearly there's two different sides in this interpretation. I mean, one side is saying there's no comparison, one side is clearly evil and one's not, and the other side says no, there's fault to be seen on both sides. And so you walk into this situation with your social beliefs, and you interpret what you see as a result. So this was a really interesting football game between Dartmouth and Princeton way back, 1951. And it was an ugly game. There was a lot of infractions. But afterwards, they basically asked the students, who committed the most infractions? And it's a little less than clear, but clearly what happened was Dartmouth students were much more likely to see Princeton infractions, and Princeton students were much more likely to see Dartmouth infractions. So your biases that you bring to the situation influence what you see. Our social intuitions, oh, I like this, are often powerful, but sometimes powerless. Yeah, social intuitions are pretty powerful stuff. We make decisions on a dual track system. Now, this isn't cognitive psychology, but if this were cognitive psychology, I would be talking about how the majority of the decision making that we have is done in an unconscious way. You know, you're driving down the road. This is a great example. And you're in your lane and you're driving, and then out of the corner of your eye, you see another car coming up on your left side, and it kind of feels like it might be drifting, and you have to make a decision, lickety split. Is this car drifting into your lane or not? And this decision has to be made so quickly. There's no time to rationally think about this. And so we make the decision, but yet at the same time, we have the ability to make some decisions and rationally and logically. And it's the same way in social psychology. In social situations, what happens is somebody's walking towards you. You have to make a decision. Is this person dangerous? And you can make some rational things, but by far the majority of the time, your decision about whether or not this person approaching me is dangerous or not is done at the subconscious level outside of your awareness. Okay? Yeah. Social influences shape our behavior. Yes, what you find attractive or tasty depends on where you grew up. Did I not tell you on the other first video that of course, but in social psychology, this is really the social psychology of American people, right? Different parts of the world have radically different opinions, ideas, beauty, fairness. I mean, in almost every concept that you can imagine, other cultures have different definitions. External, personal attitude, shape, behavior, yeah. But I decided to add Eclipse Edition, because, hey, you're out there watching the eclipse, but guess what? This is social psychology. So I found an article titled, Why the Eclipse is the Best Experienced in a Crowd. Okay, I talk about social psychology. Heck, they interviewed a bunch of social psychologists for it. So I love this picture from the 1950s. You got these heads with children with their heads in boxes. I love that. And I was thinking how dumb the kids look, but look at the adult. He's staring straight up at the eclipse. That's the plug in the box. What an idiot. In the next picture, he's one. I don't know. Let's be careful. But anyway, check this out. If you watch the eclipse in a large crowd, you can maximize emotional intensity. All right? I like that. There's a lot of studies that show that emotion that is shared is way different than emotion that you experience alone. I like this little blip that I just put down on the bottom. There was this really cool study done where they had two cameras at a bowling alley, one facing the pins and one facing away from the pins. And so the bowlers would come up, and when they would bowl a strike, the camera was watching their face. They did not smile at all when they got that, even though the strike itself should have been the happy event. Instead, what happened was these bowlers, they turned around to the people that they were bowling with, and then they smiled. Okay? So clearly, the emotional intensity is much different when it's shared with others. And by the way, the eclipse is a pretty emotional event. If you want to see it, it's pretty cool. Connecting with strangers, I like that. Sometimes, you know, the eclipse is like a great equalizer. All of a sudden, a group of random strangers have something in common. They have a common group identity. We find that barriers fall. I mean, look at this image here. It's here. This was in Egypt, and you've got Asian people there, you've got Middle Eastern people there, you've got all kinds of people there, and guess what? They have a sense of us, a very, very large group of people from a diverse background that normally would never contact each other now have become us. We'll come across this in some very cool work by Muzaffar Sharif in the Roberts Cave study later on. But basically, Muzaffar Sharif set up a situation where there was two groups of boys, and he set up competition with them, and these boys hated each other. Oh my goodness, they were competitive. They were stealing from each other. It was really bad. But then the boys were presented with a common problem and created a common identity. They had a problem that could only be problems that could only be solved by working together. And very quickly, just like these people here in Egypt, the sense of us versus them melted away almost instantly. Okay, so clearly the eclipse is a social event and related to social psychology. What other kinds of things? Social behavior is biologically rooted. I like this. This is a freaky phrase. I would have never written this. I'm certain I took this from Myers. Many of our social behaviors reflect a deep biological wisdom. And it sounds freaky, but fact is that evolution applies to social behavior. Evolution applies to, of course, things such as biological structures. And as I teach in some of my other classes, evolution also applies to cognitive functioning and cognitive structures, but it also applies to social behaviors. Absolutely. Humans have evolved to be social creatures. Don't get me wrong, there's brain structures involved, biological changes, structural changes that allow for the social behaviors. We are uniquely adapted to our social environment, okay? Very much so. Our inherited human nature predisposes us to behave in ways that helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce. Gotcha? So, biological structures are subject to adaptation or evolutionary selection. Cognitive structures are subject to evolutionary selection, and social behaviors, they all count. Okay? Social neuroscience is a newer area where they're trying to find the biological correlates of social behaviors, and they're finding some cool stuff. We find that social psychology's principles are applicable to everyday life. Check out this video, all right? Social neuroscience in advertising, taking advantage of how the brain works to change advertising. That sounds kind of dangerous if you ask me, but it's there. Okay, what's this now? Social psychology and human values. Yeah, a scientist is, the goal of science is to sort of, maybe putting it simplistically, to read the book of nature, to just, with no preconceived ideas, go out there, be ready to see whatever you want, interpret it, but guess what? The researchers choose the topics they choose that they want to study, and they ignore the ones that they do not want to study. Researchers in social science, I don't know, that's crazy crap. That must have come from Myers. I wouldn't have written that. But check this out. There are subjective parts of science, absolutely. Like we said, we should just read the book of nature or something. But clearly there are assumptions. I have theories. In some perfect world, I will keep my eyes open to evidence which supports or rejects my theory or something like that. But the fact is, I'm going to design studies which are designed to support my theory. That's the thing. Or designed to test my theory, I guess. But anyway, we find that these assumptions are there, and these assumptions can often be influenced by culture, all right? Again, we make assumptions about what we expect to find based on the culture that we grew up in. What is this one? Oh, yeah, Abraham Maslow's idea of a self-actualized person. We'll talk that one in the next topic. Was a description of himself. It's like, the perfect psychologically healthy functioning is me. Yeah, it's awesome in Maslow. But very cool values, and we'll get into the question of counseling and therapy with people from a different cultural background than yourself. We'll do that far later in the course. We find that a lot of social psychology, people look at it and go, well, that's just common sense. Everybody knew that. And it's like, well, I don't know about that. Check out these little adages. Birds of a feather flock together. Okay, but what about this adage? Opposites attract. They both make sense, right? Wait, what? Can't have both. The more the merrier. Yeah, sure, bring it all on. Two's company, three's a crowd. Wait, that can't both be right if you get the idea. And so here's a question. You see the rabbit that's sitting here, right? Isn't that a nice, pretty rabbit? I love you, bunny rabbit. Well, check it out. It's a duck. Wait, what? Yeah, what seems like common sense, all of a sudden, I love this. This is Voltaire. Now he's sounding real smart. Voltaire, okay. common sense is not particularly common. And this is really true. I mean, there is very little that is common sense. Some other things that mess with social psychology is the hindsight bias, or the I knew it all along kind of a thing. And after an event has happened, and this happens in so many situations, we look back at a criminal and say, oh, it was inevitable that they were going to do this or something. It's just like, that doesn't help us. Like Nostradamus, if you remember Nostradamus, what was it, 15th century or something, made all of these funky predictions. And it'd be awesome, and then they've all come true. But here's the thing, they're written so cryptically that nobody really knows what he's predicted until after it happened. So I don't know how useful that is. Here was a study that I supervised. When I was up in Missouri, one of my students ran this study. So before Thanksgiving 2003, all right, it was Thanksgiving, and there was a Thanksgiving football between the Packers and the Lions. All right. So now what happened was she asked. It was Kristen Werner and I don't know the Mitchell, but Kristen did most of the work. And she went around and asked, her classmates and others who they thought was going to win this football game between the Packers and the Lions, and then how confident they were in that guess. And then after, see, what happened was the Lions won. But I'm over it. That was a long time ago. So, anyway, comes back from Thanksgiving, and she asked them, who did you think was going to win? And all of a sudden, there were some people that had said Green Bay originally that flipped and said, yeah, I thought it was going to be the Lions. And some of them maybe didn't flip their opinion. They said, yeah, I did think the Packers were going to lose or win. I did think the Packers were going to win, but I wasn't that confident in that, all right? And so all of a sudden they either flipped what they believed or at least flipped the confidence or decreased their confidence in it. Social psychology, yes. Hypotheses. This is science, right? So we're going to have some science. Our job in science is to discover the truth to big questions. Often, let's just keep a very simple question. Let's say, for example, you want to know what is the opinion of the President of the United States. It's not political. Trust me, I'll get political later. And so what happens is, this is a question which would be wonderful. What's the opinion? But there's like 350 million Americans or something. How are you going to get that truth? In a perfect world, you would look at every single person in the United States, get their opinion on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you get? And then average every single one of these Americans. But that's not feasible. It's probably not even possible because there's some Americans that are living in, I don't know, Swahili or something. I don't know, I guess Swahili is a language, but you know the idea, right? They're living overseas, you can't find them, and so all of a sudden, what you're going to have to do is draw a sample, right? All the American people would be the population. It's not possible to access a population, even though that's really the question you want to have, so you draw a sample. You draw a sample of Americans, get their opinion, and then using the information from the sample, use that as your best guess for what the population would look like, all right? And you've seen this stuff in opinion polls when they say things such as 36% approve of the president plus or minus 4%. The margin of error, because they recognize, though the answer from this sample is the best guess I have, it's probably not exactly accurate. And they said, if it were possible to ask the opinion of every single person, then I believe that the answer would be between, 36 plus or minus 4. The answer would be between 40 and 32. I'm 95% confident that the true answer is between 40 and 32. All right, that's kind of what that comes down to. So here is a little image which probably looks familiar because you've probably seen it in every single science course that you've ever had. We find that all science starts with observations. First, we have uncontrolled observations. We see stuff. We go, oh, look at that. That's very interesting. And so maybe, let's see if I can come up with a simple example. Okay. So let's say, for example, A student, I just gave back their test and they got an A. I don't know, whatever. Got an A. And so then what happened was that student smiled, and then that student was very friendly. And I was like, wait a minute. Happy people are friendly people. And I'm just, this is an uncontrolled situation, uncontrolled. And so I use these uncontrolled observations and I generate a theory. And maybe I say, happy people are friendly people. That is my theory. I theorize that people that are happy are friendly. And so what that does is I will take that theory and generate a hypothesis which is going to start to be testable. In a perfect world, hypothesis should be an if-then kind of a statement. If people are happy, then they will be friendly. Perfect. That's nice. However, of course, happy and friendly are awful vague terms. Now, I'm not doing a research methods class, but we know when we use these vague terms or hypothetical constructs, we darn well better operationally define them. What do you mean by happy and friendly? Okay? And so you will create a very specific prediction which says something like, if people are given something they enjoy, then they will exhibit more, then the degree of smile will increase. I don't know. You're going to have to define these concepts in these terms and create a testable situation where you will then move to observe, and you will get observations in a controlled setting, okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more. And so these controlled observations using statistics to test whether or not these observations support the theory or not. And so we find that uncontrolled observations are at the beginning. It comes around to controlled observations, which may or may not support the theory. It's a beautiful idea because in a perfect world, science is self-correcting. Okay? In a perfect world. Theories, yeah, I think a better definition of theory is something like a tentative explanation for observations. I kind of like that better. Hypothesis is a testable prediction. Again, a good hypothesis will be in the form of an if-then statement. You can do research in the field or in the laboratory. The field is, if you do research outside, out at the mall or something like that, it's sometimes better because it's more real, right? It has more external validity. But unfortunately, out in the mall or something, there's many uncontrolled factors. It's almost impossible to get controlled observations. So if you do it in a laboratory, you can have controlled observations, but sometimes those observations are sterile and don't necessarily mean anything. Okay? We'll talk briefly about observational, correlational, and experimental research. Observational research is literally like it sounds, going out and observing things. It's, if you want to know, I mean, one of the simplest examples in this is Jane Goodall, who wanted to know about the social behavior of chimpanzees, and she recognized that the social behavior of chimpanzees in the zoos was probably not reflective of how chimpanzees actually behave. So what she did was she went out to Kenya? I don't know. She went out to East Africa somewhere. And she sat out in the woods for years and years and years until she became just part of the background. Because of course what happened was, and in all research, by the way, in fact, going back to way before psychology was born, you've got Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is a basic idea that when we observe something, the very act of observing it changes it. So our search for the truth is fundamentally modified by the very fact that we're searching for it. And so Jane Goodall said, okay, look, if I want to have, find actual chimpanzee behavior, the thing is when she first went out there, the chimpanzee's behavior was a reaction to her presence. So their behavior was still not natural. So she sat there for years and years and years to eliminate the reactivity of these chimpanzees. Observational research is useful. It's good for certain things, especially if you're doing observational research in terms of surveys, because surveys are quick and cheap. They have benefits, but they have limitations very much. Surveys, for example, your survey is only as good as the sample that you've managed to get. That's important. The order that the questions are asked can sometimes influence the results people give. The options that you use on the survey may influence how they respond. The way you frame the questions, the kind of questions that you ask, like look at this. Only 27% agreed government censorship of media and sexual violence is a good thing, but 66% agree with more restrictions to what is shown on television. It's the same question, but one included the word censorship, and the word censorship is a naughty word. Only 27% were willing to agree with a statement that involved the word censorship. Remove the word censorship, you're up to 66% support. Correlational research is interesting, but again, kind of like observational research, what you're doing is you're going out there and you're simply measuring two things that already exist, two or more, by the way. I mean, we'll talk two for now, but two or more things that already exist. So what happens is you find naturally occurring relationships, and there's a lot of very cool naturally occurring relationships out there. But what happens is you can predict things with correlational work, but you cannot infer causation. So even if you find two things are related to each other, you dare not say one causes the other. Describes a relationship. Let me show you what this might be. I don't think I like that one. Let me see this. Look at this. Some positive correlations. There's a positive correlation between height and weight. So, for example, right here, the positive correlation between height and weight. So, as height gets larger, weight tends to get larger, okay? It's not a perfect connection here, but we can see that even though it's not a one-to-one function, that there is some relationship between these two, and this is a fairly powerful correlation. Whereas in a negative correlation, in fact, I'll use this as an opportunity. Well, other positives, by the way, age and job satisfaction. Generally speaking, the older you are, the more satisfied you are with your job. Now, again, there's lots of exceptions. This is definitely not everybody, but there is a general relationship. Salary and years of education. Generally, the more years of education you have, the higher your salary. But again, it's not completely true because, oh my God, I got like 87 years of education and look at my salary. But doesn't change the fact that the correlation is still there. Huh? A couple of other things, sure, but how about negatives? A negative correlation, let's say grade point average and number of hours watching television. So check this out, this negative relationship. As the number of hours watching television goes up, grade point average goes down. Negative relationship. But again, there's lots of exceptions. There's lots of room for variability in that relationship. However, the one that I can tell you, the one that made me into a psych major, right? It's a good story. So Dr. Lee McCann in my intro psych class, it must have been the first couple of weeks because, you know, it's research methods. And he tells us a correlation between the row you sit in the class and the grades you were sitting. And so, row 1, so when the row number is low, the grades are high. So those sitting in the front row get the best grades, generally, and as you progress your way back and the row number increases. And I was sitting in a classroom, I don't even have an eraser, so this is going to be dangerous business because I can't get rid of it when I'm done. But here I go, right there I thought. Okay, so here's the deal. I was in this classroom. It was shaped kind of like a funnily weird shape like this, and the prof is up here, and there's rows of seats like this, and this, and this. Great big giant lecture hall. Meanwhile, up in the back here, it really went up like this, and so there's a single seat back there. And I'm sitting in that seat right there. So it's like row number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, row number 30 or some crap like that, right? And so now I'm a sophomore in college, and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute now, let me see if I got this right. He says, if you sit in a higher row number, you get a lower grade. Wait a minute, is he telling me I'm going to get a -40 in his class because I'm in the back row? So I'm like, the highest. I was like, bullshit. McCann, you're not going to tell me that I'm going to fail your class. I am going to pass. So I worked so hard in that class. You can't even imagine how hard I studied that class. I got like 138% or something. I don't know, and it was just amazing. And so then what happened is that I was happy. I was like, screw you, old man. I proved you wrong. I sat in the, and you know what? I even showed up early every single day to make sure I got that back seat every single time because I really wanted to prove to him he was an idiot. But the fact is, at the end, guess what? The relationship still held. The relationship was still there. Huh? Imagine the relationship. You go ding ding, here's row, here's grade, dot dot dot. Wait, no, negative dot 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 dot. Here's my class. Here's my class. But guess what? There's me right there. Okay? I was in the last row with the highest grade. And guess what happened? Even though I was an exception to the rule, it was still there. The relationship was still powerful and still strong, even though I tried to prove that McCann was an idiot. Well, he's not, by the way. He was a pretty darn smart dude, and I'm going to give him credit now that I'm older and wiser. Well, whatever, older anyway. Okay, very cool. So, anyway, good stuff. All right. How about this? Here's a correlation. There's a correlation between the age at death and the height of a grave pillar. Yeah. If you're older, you have a higher. If you're older when you die, you have a higher grave pillar. It's like, wait, what? We need to always understand the outside. Remember, correlation does not imply causation. The age at which you die does not cause the height of your gravestone. No, there's probably an outside factor. If you're rich, you have access to good medicine. If you have access to good medicine, you live longer. And if you're rich, you can afford a better gravestone. So it's like the amount of wealth you have explains this relationship rather than, of course, the relationship itself. What is this one? One of the most important distinctions, in fact, we're going to do experimental research in a second, but one of the most important things is experimental research is awesome because experimental research allows us to do one thing that no other method does, and that is establish cause and effect, okay? A causes B. I like A causes B, and this, again, this is not your methodology class, but A causes B is a powerful thing. Because if you can establish that simple statement, A causes B, you can control the world. Because you just look at it and go, I love B. B is something I really enjoy. And if A causes B, turn on A and B will follow. You're done. And if B is something you don't like and you know A causes B, turn off A and B will not happen. You really control the world. But in order to establish this A causes B, you must do a solid experiment. And there's really fundamentally only one thing that you need to do. I mean, there's lots of things you need to do good experiments. But I mean, fundamentally, one thing you need to do to have an experiment, and that is random assignment. You need to be able to take people and randomly assign them to conditions. If you cannot randomly assign to conditions, you do not have an experiment. So if you wanted to do an experiment testing whether boys and girls are different in math or something like that, it's not an experiment. You cannot randomly assign a child to be a boy or a girl. So even though it might smell like an experiment, and they'll call it a quasi-experiment, it ain't an experiment. It's correlational research, and you cannot establish A causes B. So here's a couple of research questions. Are early maturing children more confident? Cannot be done as an experiment because you can't manipulate their age. Do students learn more in online or classroom courses? You can randomly assign students, so yes, it can be experimental. Do school grades predict vocational success? You can't manipulate school grades. They are what they are. Does playing violent video games increase aggressiveness? We can, in fact, randomly assign one group to play video games, one group not. That can be experimental. Do people find comedy funnier when alone or with others. Can we manipulate that? I randomly assign you to watch this comedy by yourself. Absolutely, that's an experimental, can be answered experimentally. Do higher income people have higher self-esteem? You can't manipulate that one because people's income is what it is, but you could perhaps do I can imagine an experiment using something like Monopoly and having one group randomly assigned to receive more money than the other, then it's substitute. So the answer is the way it's asked, it must be correlational, but if you're clever, you can turn it experimental. All right. Controlling and manipulating variables to establish cause and effect. Yes. We use the computer a lot because, as I said, we need to control. If you want to establish cause and effect, you need to control all other possible explanations. If you want to establish A causes B, your job is to control every single other possible factor that might possibly influence B. Nothing but A is in your game plan, and only through controlling every other possible explanation can you get it. Experimental research is better in that it allows, well, causes, tends to have good internal validity. Internal validity, as I say, is very briefly the ability to control, the ability to eliminate external factors. But as we said, experiments, especially laboratory experiments, can sometimes be artificial. And so even if you get a nice result, it's like, what does it really mean, right? I don't know. I mean, because clearly, if you want to study helping behavior, you might create some kind of a task in your laboratory that involves helping. But clearly, helping in this laboratory task really is not necessarily the same as helping, let's say, in a spontaneous auto accident where somebody needs to jump out and perform CPR or something. It's not really the same. Ecological validity, and that's again that concept of external validity, and we said that already. Field experiments tend to be high in ecological validity, that is, they're much more real, that the results are much more likely to reflect real outcomes. Lab experiments, as we said, are cleaner, but ecological validity kind of suffers. As we know in research, let's see here, we, the experimenter, manipulate an independent variable. We manipulate the independent variable, and that manipulation must have at least two conditions, right? So I might have an independent variable that involves the lights are on or the lights are off, right? And then I might randomly assign people to be either in a lights on or a lights off condition, and then I will measure some behavior or a dependent variable. And so I might say, nervousness or something. All right. Dr. Hand made me nervous, so I came up with nervousness. So all of a sudden I might measure nervousness as a dependent variable. Is it different with the lights on or off? Silly experiment, but definitely legitimate. But as I sort of hinted at earlier, in order to study something like nervousness, since I came up with it, you darn well better be able to operationally define that. Because, of course, nervousness is a vague, hypothetical construct which has no existence until you define it. Okay, very cool. Some common ones that are used, common dependent variables that are used in a lot of experimental research, things such as reaction time, that might be used as a measure of skill, something like that. Somebody that has more skill tends to be able to perform a task faster. Proportion of errors, another measure of skill or something like that. Speed accuracy trade-off is the idea that if you want to do it faster, you tend to make more mistakes. Gotcha. Sometimes we use verbal protocols. No, I don't use verbal protocols. Verbal protocols are often used in subjective research more than objective research, but they exist and they're kind of interesting. You can use verbal protocols to have people introspect. I had to swallow myself for a second. Introspect on internal processes. And then control variables are basically those that the experimenter controls. A control variable in some kind of a way is a potential independent variable. So in my silly example where the independent variable is lights on versus lights off, I'm going to make sure that in all cases the temperature of the room is exactly the same. All right. Now it's possible temperature of the room might be a very interesting independent variable, could be manipulated. But if it's not the question that I want to study, I will hold it constant so everybody in both conditions will get the same temperature. And that's what control is all about. Things that could be an independent variable in a different study, but are not the independent variable in this study. Confounds. I'm not going to focus on that. Take my experimental class, and I will pound on this one. Only true experiment. I said all this. Assignment must be random. That's right. If you don't have random assignment, you ain't got an experiment. And if you don't have random assignment, don't you dare say anything with the word cause in it. Okay? The word cause is an awfully powerful word, and you only earn that word if you did random assignment. Yeah, we said that. Yeah, we said all this kind of stuff. Again, you take my experimental class, I'll focus on that. For this class, you don't need that stuff. But here's a good experiment, a good example. Okay, so now let's say you want to find out the simple question: does violent television cause aggression? Okay, sounds simple, sounds very nice. So what you might do is randomly assign. You take a group of people, randomly assign half of them to be in the experimental group, half of them to be in the control group. Those in the experimental group will be exposed to violent television. Those in the control group will be exposed to nonviolent television. Now, in a good experiment, what you'll do is control things as well. If they watch 30 minutes of violent television, they watch 30 minutes of nonviolent television. If they watch 30 minutes of violent television in a red-colored room, they also watch it in a red-colored room. And it happens to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It happens to be, okay, every single other thing will be held constant. Because again, temperature of room, color of room, length of video, these are all possible independent variables, and in a different study, they're perfectly legitimate questions, but they're not the question in this study. Okay? So, random assignment. If you didn't randomly assign, then you're going to measure the exact same thing, aggression. And again, you darn well better have an operational definition for aggression. It depends on your population and whatnot. You might count the number of times a kid pushes another kid on a playground. You might count, I don't know, the number of times one person interrupts another and call that a form of, I don't know, it's on you, depends on your paradigm, depends on your sample. Research methods, yes, we got some of that. It's just all that nonsense. All right, and so there's a couple of things there for you. Okay, so this first topic, I admit, is not the most exciting. And I mean, maybe you got a break because of this eclipse, but you know, it'll get better, I promise you. Once we're past the research methods, we get the cool stuff. We will talk about, it's going to be great. So keep in mind you have 2 discussion assignments that are due before we meet on August 28th. That's Monday 28th. You must have one on Thursday, August 24th, and another one on Sunday, August 27th, and be ready to talk about them on the 28th.